If you have a mirror in your hallway, inside your home, please do not say the Prowler 5 times. Whoever has been known to say it has met a gruesome end. Legend has it, in 1883, a businessman named Jonathan Patrick was bludgeoned to death in front of his wall-length hallway mirror one dark and stormy night. But there was more to Jonathan than just an ordinary banker. Some think he was the notorious Prowler who killed numerous women and young couples in love. No one knows who killed Jonathan that night. Some say it was one of the victim's loved ones seeking revenge, or his own wife after finding out who he really was, deciding to kill him before he could do the same to her. Whatever the case, they say he vowed he would return as he uttered his final words. Whenever somebody calls out the Prowler, he would be there to claim his next victim. There's been 20 known cases up to now, most notably the Sanderson family. On September 18, 1992, Mr. and Mrs. Sanderson, their daughter Ellie, and her best friend Elizabeth were inside the home on that dark and stormy night. At some point, Ellie, age believed to be 16, asked her friend if she wanted to play a game. Her friend Elizabeth said yes, and Ellie walked her over to the mirror. "Have you ever heard of the Prowler?" she exclaimed. "No," Elizabeth responded, so Ellie explained everything in detail. Elizabeth had a look of concern on her face, but still went ahead. Ellie began, "The Prowler, the Prowler, the Prowler, show yourself." "I don't think we should do this," Elizabeth said nervously. "I think you should stop." "Stop being such a baby. Nothing's going to happen," Ellie replied. "The Prowler, we're waiting." "No!" Elizabeth screamed. "Don't do it!" She backed into the living room. "I don't want to play this game anymore, Ellie. Just stop." Just then a door opened down the hall, and out walked Mr. and Mrs. Sanderson. "What's all this screaming for, girls?" "Oh, nothing, Dad." Then Ellie turned around with a smile on her face and looked into the mirror. The Prowler. Just then an arm reached out of the mirror and slashed Ellie across the throat. She fell back into the living room, falling at Elizabeth's feet, gasping her last breath. Mr. and Mrs. Sanderson stood stunned in the opening of the hallway, trembling in fear. Then the apparition of the Prowler stepped out of the mirror and butchered the trembling parents. He then pointed at poor Elizabeth, who was covered in blood. "Did you call the Prowler, little girl?" Elizabeth screamed, turned to the front door, flung it open, and ran into the night. No one believed her story, and she was charged with the deaths of the Sanderson family and locked away in an institution. But people really know what happened. The deaths are becoming more frequent now. So whatever you do, no matter what your friends might say, just please, please, don't say his name. Project Luna, log entry 268. I could feel it pressing against my rib cage. I vomited from the pain as several ribs cracked from the creature stretching out its limbs. This is Dr. Neil Bryant. The date is... Oh, God. The date is September 17th, 2033. I spat blood into the recorder and erupted into a fit of coughs. Day 23 after contamination. Dr. Leslie Grant is deceased, as is Dr. Marcus Prickett. I'm due to suffer the same fate, I'm afraid. I paused, a memory of my daughter giggling as she blew on the seeds of a dandelion caused tears to well in my eyes. This will be my last log entry for Project Luna. Please refer to Journal Entry 245 for details of initial contamination. The fossils we discovered on the moon's surface were not fossils at all. They were cocoons, it seems, and the alien life forms were dormant within them. A limb stretched my abdomen impossibly far. I fell to the ground and screamed out in agony. I should have terminated myself after assisting my colleagues in doing the same. But I couldn't. I was a man of science, after all. The world needed documentation. The desire to study the incubation occurring within me was great enough to outweigh the suffering. Irrelevant now. I have sealed all exits. The creature will not escape the lab. My hypothesis is, after it consumes me, it will quickly starve before the government discovers what happened here. Tell my Lucy I love her. Dr. Bryant, signing off. I dropped the recorder and ripped open my button-down shirt. The skin pulled from one direction to the other, like an elastic putty. I could feel it shredding my intestines with tooth and claw. The blood rising in my throat threatened to kill me by asphyxiation. But I had to hold on. I had to see it. With one mighty push, the creature erupted from my body. I cried out to a god I had never believed in, as it left the cavern that was now my stomach. Blackness, the relief of death, crept into my vision. The fluorescent lights from above faded from sight. I just want to see. I had nearly drifted off when I finally heard the sound I had been waiting for. I strained my ears once Mel's door clicked back shut, and I listened to the soft thud of her steps coming down the hallway. She tiptoed by my door and began descending the stairs, skipping over the creaky third step. I waited until the porch door opened and closed again before I rose from the bed. The night before, I could have sworn I'd heard her returning home in the early morning hours. Now I was certain. I felt a mix of emotions as I went through the possibilities of what she could be doing. Anger and worry, of course, but also guilt. I'd been so absent lately, lost in my own head, barely going through the motions of being a father to her. Whatever Mel was up to, it was my inattentiveness that must have driven her to it. I pulled my jacket on and slipped into the chilly night air. I could just make out Mel's silhouette up the road, moving swiftly and ducking between the shadows. I hurried to catch up, doing my best to avoid crunching the fallen leaves under my feet. I breathed a sigh of relief as I saw her pass right by our neighbor's house with the boy she liked from the high school. But it only made me more nervous about what she could be sneaking around for. As if hearing my thoughts, she suddenly whirled around, and for a second I thought she had spotted me. She scanned the darkened street, turning her head from side to side. Before she turned back, I was able to see that she was clutching something tightly to her. But what it was, I couldn't tell. She journeyed on, walking further out of the neighborhood and climbing up the hill. My heart dropped as I finally realized where she was heading. I passed the rusted cemetery gates to find her perched on a stone wall, pulling her violin from its case. I stood, frozen in place as she began to play, softly and slowly. It was eerily beautiful. I hadn't listened to her perform in a long while, and I didn't realize just how masterful she had become. As the song began to build, my breath was taken. Shadows began to take form in the twinkling starlight. All around us, the dead were rising from their graves. I stifled a scream, holding a hand over my mouth, and watching as the apparitions began to sway to the music, as if entranced by it. One of the ghosts crept towards me, her arms outstretched, her hair flowing behind her as if she were underwater. Mel glanced up without a pause in her bowing, a smile crossing her face as she saw her mother wrapped in my arms once more. She rested her head against my chest, and under the light of the moon, we danced. "Daddy!" Phoebe yelled. "Monster!" 5 minutes ago, she was smiling and waving me goodbye as she strolled into the school grounds. Now as she was running in the opposite direction, eyes wide, face white, sweat dripping off her brow. I looked behind her. I couldn't see any monsters, just a sea of traffic during morning rush hour and birds flying to tall trees. "Monsters don't exist, sweetie," I reassured her. "This one is," Phoebe insisted. "It has big black eyes and claws and sharp teeth." At that precise moment, the school shook with screams and roars. My face paled, and immediately I took my daughter's hand to go to the car. But Phoebe stopped me. "Let's go somewhere safer, Daddy," she whispered. Before I could respond, she grabbed my hand and we darted down the streets. Looking back, I could see screaming and scared children flooding out of the school and grabbing the hands of worried, waiting parents. Black smoke billowed out of the school, inking the sky. It was like the school was on fire. Phoebe dragged me into the alleyway, a shortcut, I suppose, to the nearest MRT. The sky was so black now, we were shadows wandering in the dark. I was holding Phoebe's hand like a blind mouse. It had felt cold and clammy before, but now it felt almost wispy, like I was holding smoke. Phoebe stopped and turned to face me. Maybe it was the darkness distorting her small face, but her eyes had grown to the size of coins and were completely black, like some sort of alien. She hissed, her forked tongue darting out between sharp teeth. She reached for my throat, and the last thing I saw was crimson. I died 8 years ago. It wasn't particularly tragic or unusual, just a car accident. I don't blame the man who hit me. He was speeding because his wife was in labor, and there was black ice on the road. He lost control of the car, and I lost my life. It's not his fault. I know that. I'm not cruel. I am not vengeful. If anything, I'm the opposite. You see, I don't have any family left, and I had lost my few friends around that time. When it was time for my funeral, the only people who came were my boss and the family who killed me. The wife held her newborn daughter close to her chest. I hated my boss, and the cemetery was awfully lonely, so I followed the family home. Lily may as well have been my own flesh and blood. She was sweet and bright, and oh so very small. She had trouble sleeping if someone wasn't rocking her crib, and her parents were so tired. After they put her to bed, it was easy for me to rock her crib for her. I didn't get tired. I could help her. As the years passed, Jack and Lori realized they weren't alone in the house. It didn't take long from there to make a connection between my funeral and when I had showed up. And I'd never been malevolent, so they weren't afraid or angry. They started to burn candles on the anniversary of my death day. They left an empty chair for meals and holidays. I really felt like a member of the family. Someone is trying to force the door. It's Lori's ex. He's obsessive. He's angry. He's going to hurt the family. My family. The thing about ghosts is that the more offerings you get, the stronger you become. I'd been enjoying candles, trinkets, and even the occasional food item for the past 5 years. I was strong from that. The knife feels warm in my hand, a shock of heat against the ice of my skin. Lori, Jack, and Lily are my family. I care about them, and they're not going to join me. Yet. Earth was a sinking ship, and the distant planet Blair 412 was its lifeboat. Mars had never been the answer. Even creating a breathable atmosphere could take at least hundreds of years, time that humanity did not have. Blair 412, much more like Earth, had been made livable in a few decades, the product of a stress bloom of innovation and cooperation. Thousands of scientists and engineers lived there, and now the first groups of regular people were being invited for the multi-year trip. Teachers, artists, bankers, athletes, a hopeful sign that mankind's new home was more than just a space station where experts had to work around the clock. Laura didn't know much about the planet. Communication was slow and narrow, limited to telemetry, logs, and reports. There would be no pictures or video for a while. As she submitted her application, she worried about both outcomes. What if she was selected? It was a life-changing commitment. On the other hand, what if she was left behind? Cryosleep was a simple process, they explained. They put you under, and you wake up at your new home. It was as safe as a cross-country flight, and would not seem to take as long. Laura was helped into her pod by white-suited scientists that looked a lot like doctors. The lid closed, a sweet-smelling gas filled the pod, and she went to sleep. How long the trip felt, she could not tell. She recalled an old short story where a child had forced himself awake during a similar trip and gone insane. For Laura, time did pass, but she had no feeling for how long. During a dream that was far too abstract to be remembered. Her pod hissed open. She felt fine, naturally a bit groggy. She blinked awake and sat up. The bay was filled with monsters, aliens. Something had gone horribly wrong. They had skin the color of pine needles, extra limbs, and a triangle of 3 yellow eyes and a wrinkled face. They were not attacking, it seemed, but she was alarmed to see one of them climbing out of a pod. What had they done with the other humans? What would they do to her? She tried to pull her pod lid closed, but it wouldn't budge. The bay hatched open, and another alien climbed through. It started to speak, to explain, and Laura found that she could understand. Blair 412 was somewhat like Earth, but not enough to step off of a spaceship and breathe. There wasn't a lot of time, and there weren't a lot of choices. Humanity had to compromise to meet its new home in the middle. They called it Cryosleep, but it was not a simple freeze, sleep, and thaw cycle. Instead, it was a pupation, a necessary next stage of life. This had been the most astonishing innovation of all. The sleep pod was a chrysalis. Laura climbed out of her pod, getting accustomed to her new form, and joined the others. "Oh, darling, never leave me," Mia whispered in my ear. I think it was meant to be arousing. Why would I want to? I lied. There are so many other women who have everything I do and more, Mia replied, looking through me. But you're different. I tried to think of something else, but fell short. She rose and started dressing. That's right. Different. Mia, don't go. Maybe I want to, she said icily, walking through the door. Secretly, I was relieved. I can't explain it. Part of me loved her, while the rational part of me said I wasn't capable. I refused to see her for the next few days. I kept myself busy, going out after work, so I wouldn't have a chance to be with her. I pretended that nothing was off, that I didn't want to see her or hear her sweet voice. For a few weeks, I went through the motions. After that, I was actually doing well. Steadily, I was getting over Mia. So naturally, I met someone new. Her name was Ariel. Things started to heat up, and pretty soon I found myself at her place. We devoured every piece of each other. Then we wanted seconds. I held her close as we began drifting into blissful sleep. I awoke to something shaking the bed. At first I thought it was Ariel, rising from the mattress. Then I realized she was still nestled up against me. Ariel was awakened by then. "Are you seeing this?" she cried. We were 2 feet off the ground, being tossed like a ship on the deep sea. Shadows began morphing into tentacles. I watched in horror as they caught a hold of Ariel's wrists and ankles, rising her up to the ceiling. I looked up at the black cloud hovering there. In the center, a familiar face loomed, her features distorted by rage. Mia, in her true and terrifying form. "How could you? She is nothing. I am so much more." A shower of blood rained down on me as Ariel's limbs were taken off. Eventually, the screaming stopped, but the sound of Ariel being torn apart continued. Pieces of her falling like bloody bits of confetti. I swayed back and forth, clutching my knees. Mia swooped down, returning to the form I met her in. "I should have told you that I'm the jealous type." She laughed, her voice back to its usual pitch. "So now I'm here, writing this to try and spare anyone who might make the same mistake I made. Mia was an apparition when I first saw her, a spirit that I helped give life to. I let myself get entangled, somehow convincing myself there would be no consequences. Now she owns pieces of me that I can never get back. Even after I pass away, She will be there with me, keeping her grip on me. She's the jealous type, and she wants me all to herself. He did not believe in the supernatural or spiritual side of life. Young Todd only began to question things once he lost someone near and dear to him. After bullying people for believing in crystals, ghosts, and auras for years, he decided to try his hand at reaching out to the dead. After a long day of denial and grieving, Todd decided to try his hand at some quiet meditation. He had read online that this had brought people peace and happiness. When this came back with no results, his sadness and anger got the best of him. He began to cry and shout for his deceased father, but there was no answer. After a brief freakout, filled with tossing pillows and cursing, Todd decided to get into the more supernatural side of the internet. He discovered many things, like tarot card readings and how to protect yourself from angry spirits. But he was most intrigued by the idea of a seance. The idea of being able to communicate with his father again overcame any fear Todd had of angry spirits invading his home. He printed the article he found, gathered the supplies, and was going to wait until nightfall. The lights were off, the house was empty, and the candles were lit. It was time. Todd sat with his sweaty palms facing the ceiling. He sat in silence before mustering up enough courage to invite the spirits into his home. I open the door and invite the spirits into my home, he quietly muttered. When nothing happened, the same sadness and anger overcame Todd, and he began to curse again. "Fuck you!" he shouted. "Bring me my father!" As the last syllable came off his tongue, the candles were immediately blown out. Sitting in pure darkness, Todd remained still and quiet. "Son?" a voice in the darkness called. "Dad?" Todd replied. Todd heard footsteps quickly approaching him and grabbed his phone to use a flashlight. Thinking it was his father, he ran towards the sound of the footsteps, hastily wanting to embrace his father. Todd raced towards the sound of footsteps until he suddenly hit a wall in his living room. There was no one. A tap on his shoulder sent a shiver down Todd's spine. He turned around. Nothing. When he turned back towards the wall, a face so terrifying, so evil, looked him dead in the eyes. Before he even got the chance to think about running, his soul was mine. One afternoon in 1959, my grandfather was on duty at Nellis Air Force Base, located in the Las Vegas desert. He held the rank of Master Sergeant and was an aircraft mechanic. The day was as regular as any other, nothing out of the ordinary, just a long day of maintenance on the aircraft. As the sun set and my grandfather and his crew were wrapping up work on a B-52, a call came down to have 2 F-105s fueled and loaded, ready for takeoff in 5 minutes. My grandfather and his crew hurried the preparations, and they were ready to go. Word leaked out that an unidentified object was seen on radar, hovering around French Mountain. The tower tried contacting the aircraft, but it did not receive a response. The 2 pilots being sent out to intercept the aircraft was a captain, Roger Phillip, my grandfather's brother-in-law, and a lieutenant, Richard Marks, my grandfather's best friend. They scrambled the jets and took off towards the mountains. My grandfather and his crew ran out of the hangar and watched in concern. After about 5 minutes, the crew on the ground could see bright flashes in the night sky. The jets were shooting at the unidentified aircraft. A minute later, they could see an explosion from the mystery aircraft, with a flame trailing behind it, until it crashed into the side of Sheep's Peak Mountain, which caused a huge explosion the crew could see from the base. Rescue crews were sent out, but nothing is known what was brought back. The pilots and my grandfather's crew were ordered to stay quiet and were threatened with a court-martial if they did not follow orders. My grandfather, the first chance he got, when alone with his brother-in-law, asked what he saw up there. He said it was something he'd never seen before. It was a shining metallic-like material he had never seen. There were no windows, no markings of any kind, and had strange lights coming from underneath the craft, and it moved so fluidly, nothing like he'd ever seen, nothing our military has, that's for sure. It must have been something of importance, though, because not long after they got back, a couple of government suits sat down and interviewed them, he told my grandfather. Yeah, we were talked to as well, my grandfather replied. UFO is what they called it, he said to my grandfather. What the hell is that? Unidentified flying object, they say, is what it stands for. This was all covered up, of course. This isn't one of the famous encounters you've heard about. Almost, though. Lieutenant Richard Marks and 2 of my grandfather's crew were going to go to one of the local Vegas newspapers and tell them the story, despite my grandfather's pleas against doing so. On the day of the interview, the lieutenant and the 2 crewmen did not show up, and they were never heard from again. Ever since I've been a kid, I had trouble sleeping. Most therapists couldn't explain it. Some came up with theories that proved bullshit. Nothing ever helped. Every other night, I wake up sweating and breathing hard in my bed, and I see things. Sometimes it's visions of people I know dying or killing. Sometimes it's monsters, vampires, boogeymen, things that do not fit in 3 dimensions, things with too many or too few body parts, and sometimes wicked, twisted human forms that cannot be real. At least, that's what I tell myself. At first, I thought it was nightmares, since after the apparitions, I would always go back to sleep. But always, they accompany me through the days. I can see them from the corner of my eye, or I feel their presence behind me, or in a mirror. And people who sleep in my room sometimes get woken up by my shaking, my half-strangled cries, my panting. They all say that my eyes are wide open, disturbingly fixed on some point of the room. In those moments, nothing can break my trance. It makes it hard to sleep with someone. It makes it hard to function properly. Thus, I still live with my parents. They always took care of me, trying to understand what I went through. My mother even made me write down everything I saw, hoping to see a pattern emerge, I suppose. But talking about it, writing about it, makes it worse. In my awoken moments, I want to forget my nights entirely. So through the years, despite her encouragements, I stopped describing those things. I stopped talking about the details to my loved ones, to my therapist, to anyone. I can never find the right words anyway. This night, I woke to my door creaking slowly open. I saw a white form enter. It was a dog or a wolf. A large fucking thing, with blue eyes and great teeth and a red tongue. It slowly made its way to me and stayed right by my bed, sniffing the air and growling in my ear for a long, long time. In the morning, when I came down and sat at the table, my mom saw it by my face that I had seen something. She's always extra kind on those mornings. She sat in front of me while I ate my scrambled eggs and bacon. She took my hand in hers, sighed, and told me, "You know, that dog was just like the others. They can't really hurt you." I froze.